Welcome to Wellspring on the Air. I'm Lindsey Steffen, a therapist at Wellspring and the host of today's show about trauma. So today we are going to be talking about what is trauma, talking about PTSD and just different things that come with trauma. So with me today to discuss this interesting topic is Goumah Conde. Thank you so much for being here today, Goumah.
You're welcome, Lindsey. Glad to be here.
Yes. So together we're going to cover this topic. We have a lot of info to throw your way, so buckle up, get ready, and we will try to make it concise and understandable. I think most people go through trauma in their life. It's actually common, but we may just not call it trauma or recognize that it is traumatic and our body experiences it as trauma. So we'll go ahead and just dive in since we have so much info, Goumah. So what is trauma? Can you define it for us?
Well, so in simple terms, trauma is really just anything that is deeply disturbing or distressing that affects us and especially our ability to cope. So when something bad happens and we find ourselves unable to cope with it, very emotional, cannot stop being emotional, that pretty much is what trauma looks like.
Okay, got it. So someone might think, oh, I have trauma, but do I have PTSD? How could we kind of figure out what is the difference and what are signs and symptoms of PTSD?
So what I really say to my clients, especially the younger ones, and I think I really want to speak to our younger clients today, and it's for everybody, but especially younger kids, because we know that during this COVID, they're really struggling with a lot of crisis and PTSD symptoms. So I really just say trauma is what happens and PTSD is the result of what happens, right?
Okay.
So something bad happens to us and that is the trauma. Now we begin to experience different feelings because of what happened to us. Those feelings we call symptoms, right? Whether it's the anxiety or it's headaches or the withdrawal, or some younger kids may start to wet the bed, or they may have nightmares, or they cannot stop thinking about what happened, right? Just keep reliving the experience. All of those will be what we call the PTSD because those are the symptoms of the trauma.
Okay, so actually noting some PTSD symptoms might be a way someone identifies that they had a trauma. Maybe they didn't think so, but after a car accident, if you're having a lot of nightmares, you're having flashbacks, you have anxiety driving, you might be experiencing PTSD, and that's exactly good to get checked out by a professional.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, how does trauma affect the brain? I know it does. So we definitely want to educate our listeners on the grave effects on the brain.
Yeah. No, it really does. As a matter of fact, that's really where it hits us first, right? Because our brain is really what tells our body what's happening to us, what's going on. So in the way I like to explain this is using really this credit is to Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the renowned trauma experts. And I like how he describes how trauma affects the brain. He talks about we have our frontal lobe, which is what we know that's a scientific name, right? And then we have our brain stem. But I like how he calls this. He calls it our watchtower. So the frontal lobe is your watchtower. And then the brain stem, he calls your smoke detector, okay? So if you think about a smoke detector, its primary function is to alarm us that something bad is about to happen. I see smoke, the house is getting a little warm, it's fuzzy, something is going on here. And that's kind of what the brainstem does for us when we have trauma. So in a healthy, normal individual who's not, and I hate to use the word normal, but I'm using it just because. So let's just say someone who hasn't experienced anything bad, anything distressing in his or her life, the frontal lobe plays its role, which is to regulate our body. It pretty much is the one that keeps us in check, right? It tells you, no, this isn't true. Nothing bad is happening. It's okay. You're safe here. That's the role of the frontal lobe. Well, when we have trauma, it's almost as if the brain shifts and your frontal lobe really takes a back seat and your smoke detector takes over. The brainstem takes over the body. So we end up functioning in what I call feeling brain more so than our thinking brain. So our thinking brain isn't really as active because we're not being logical in that moment, and rightfully so, but we're being more reactive, right? And that's how trauma affects the brain. So feeling brain takes over and thinking brain is really suppressed when you have trauma.
So we lose our logic. So you might notice, why am I making unwise decisions? Why am I impulsive? I'm not thinking clearly. I'm not myself. You might be experiencing that where you're just stuck in that emotional brain. And it's almost like both sides aren't firing and wiring together. You're just stuck in the really like a survival mode, really, where it's all emotion, all high alert, and you can't kind of calm down enough to think, let me do a pros and cons list or figure out how to make this decision.
Right, that is correct. And sometimes I say to a client, it's almost like you're going to put the house out or put the fire out even when there's no fire in the house, right? So everything is alarming to you, even though there may not be anything alarming that's going on. But that is the body's way of fighting, trying to figure out what is wrong, what's going on here. Something bad has happened to me and I don't quite get it.
Yeah.
So,
I explain it to my kids in therapy that it's your alarm system is malfunctioning. So you see something and there's no danger, but your brain starts going woo, woo, woo. And so you're always in that kind of hyper vigilant state and very on edge with anxiety. So
that's correct.
Okay. Well, how would a listener right now, if they're listening and kind of maybe resonating a bit with this, how could they know a little bit more if they, or maybe someone they're thinking of in their life, if they are actually struggling with PTSD?
No, I love that. So let me just really so when something bad happens to someone, you want to start observing, especially if you have a child in the home, right? Or even an adult. You want to start observing that person and you're looking to see if there are changes in behavioral patterns. Really, that's what you're looking for. So you have a child who's upbeat or, for the most part, is relatively excited about life, hopeful, right, about things to come in the future. All of a sudden, this person is regressed, right? They don't have hope anymore, or you have a child who was potty trained and now they're wetting the bed again. That's really a big sign for younger children, regression. You want to look for that. This child was secure and a parent could leave the home and the child was secure. All of a sudden, the child is latching on and they're really struggling to let you go. They want to stay in your bed night after night after night when they've been sleeping in their own room. You want to look for those things. And for adults, you want to look for isolation. Okay. Is this person isolating, or just staying away from family gatherings, or just staying away from their friends coming over? Are they avoiding people? Or they're sleeping more than usual?
Okay.
Right. Or are they staying awake all night and not being able to sleep?
Got it. Yeah, I always look at our sleep. That's a huge indicator that something's off. We're sleeping more than usual or not enough, or even appetite. Are you eating more, eating less? Those kind of those biological functions, necessary things just for survival and living. You notice they get interrupted first a lot of the time.
That's correct. Yeah. So you really just want to look out for those things. So mainly again, in children, you want to be looking for regression, and in adults, look for isolation and look for changes in behavioral patterns. That's really a good measure to use.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, because I think we have kids grow up in the same home and one goes down one path and one the other. So one develops PTSD and one seems to be very high functioning. So why do some develop PTSD and some don't?
Well, the first thing I will say here is that we know scientifically that children are really resilient. Children are resilient. So we shouldn't take that for granted. However, science has not been quite able to prove why one person, survives trauma and they're able to cope and they're out and functioning. Another person may completely be overwhelmed by the trauma symptom. But what we do know is that a big part of it is really just our level of resilience. And some people may have the full, what we call, meet all the criteria for PTSD, and others may just display symptoms here and there, right? Sporadic. And somebody may have anxiety, or maybe they will have depression, but it wouldn't meet all the criteria. So they're not, 6 months out, still in bed, can't move, having nightmares. However, we still need to treat each symptom. So even if it's anxiety that this person is showing, we want to be able to get help for that person, because there may be other things that may come later on that are not showing up right now.
Got it. Yeah, and there's a diagnosis in our DSM that we use to diagnose for late onset PTSD. So
Correct.
I believe that's 6 months after the event, you start to notice symptoms. So it's interesting how God made us where we are different. Some
Mhm,
people, they within the day, they are visibly traumatized, and others, it's
mhm,
like it hits them months later. So you can stay in
mhm.
shock a long time or kind of have dissociated and almost
Right.
left to the experience
Yeah.
in your mind. So there's a lot of factors. Yeah. And we don't know for
Yeah.
sure why one person responds this way and another in a different way, but we know that it does happen. So
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
uncommon.
Yeah. No, we don't. And some people are spontaneous. They just come right back. And but that doesn't mean that we're not still observing and looking to see if they're okay.
Yeah, people can
Mhm.
actually be high functioning with PTSD. I've had clients come who I would not guess they had PTSD, even as a mental health clinician. But once we do their assessment, we see they do have PTSD, even though
Mhm.
they're in a family, raising their kids, going to work. They're not in the bed, like the stereotype of a non functioning person. So
Yeah.
that's always very interesting to me how people can be high functioning, even depressed or anxious, and you would never know because it's all internal. None of the symptoms seem to be outward.
Well, one of my favorite saying, and this was really a sermon title for me once I preached at a church, but the sermon title was "Depression is not in the doing, it's in the feeling,"
Mm,
right? Because so many people are busy doing, yet they're feeling very depressed, and we have no idea.
yeah.
Okay, so we really need to pay attention to how asking more and exploring more about people's feelings, because that's what a depression is.
Yeah, you're right. And a lot of people, they avoid the depression or anxiety facing it by being busy. That's a huge
Yeah, by doing.
indicator. Yeah, you never rest. You never have a quiet time, slow down. Like, no, I can't do that. Then I'd feel everything. Say, okay, let's start there. Yeah.
Exactly.
All
Exactly.
right. Well, I
Mhm.
think we have time for one more question before we take a break. So,
Right.
what about people who say it feels like the trauma is happening over and over again?
Mhm, mhm. Well, because really, again, we want to go back to brain, right? That's how the brain works.
Okay.
You're really in that brainstem and smoke detector mode. So what's really happening to you is you've been triggered, right?
Mm,
If you're feeling the trauma is happening over and over again, it's because you've been triggered. So for some people, sometimes just driving by a particular place, hearing somebody say something, seeing a certain color. We know, for example, people who are raped, sometimes the color red is a trigger
mm,
for those people, right?
right.
Because they're seeing blood, whatever it may be. But sometimes we're really just being triggered by things we're seeing, and that really is a clear indication that we have not done trauma resolution work.
Okay.
If we feel that we're experiencing trauma over and over again, it's because we have no resolution.
Okay. So yeah, normal stimuli in life take us
Mhm,
back to that place as if
mhm.
it's happening again, even though
Yeah,
it's not now. So we need to get
right.
help if we find ourselves in that place.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Awesome, Goumah. Well, that's the first half of the show. I hope you could all digest that and swallow it. It's a lot of good info we're throwing your way, but we're going to take a quick break. So I'm Lindsey Steffen with Wellspring on the Air, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Wellspring on the Air. This is Lindsey Steffen. If you're just joining our show, our topic is trauma. So far, I've talked with Goumah about what is trauma, what's PTSD, why do some people develop it and others not. So if you joined late, go to the podcast channel, Wellspring on the Air, or you can go to our website blog page at wellspringmiami.org, and you can catch up just by searching trauma, and you can look up Goumah Conde because she is the expert on this today who's teaching us so much. So let's dive right back in because we still have a lot to cover.
Right.
I like to talk about the difference in children and adults because trauma
Mhm.
symptoms do come up differently or they're kind of demonstrated differently. So what can you tell us about that?
Mhm. And sometimes not necessarily that it's different, except that children are a bit more expressive. You see it, and they really don't hide it as well as adults do. Again, adults are busy doing. We have life to tackle. We have bills to pay. We have families to care for, and so we just keep going. Whereas children kind of become crippled in some way sometimes by the PTSD symptoms, and so we as parents are observant and we're able to see that something is off with my child. Whereas with adults, we're not communicating our pain and suffering, and we just hold on to it. So that really is where the difference is. It's how we cope, right?
Okay. Yeah. So what would be some signs if we have a parent listening, or a tia, grandpa, grandma, whoever, what, if you have a child in your life who you're caring for, what, if they have gone through trauma, what might we see? What are some of those signs?
Yeah. Again, you want to be observant, and you're looking for regression. You're also looking for what may seem as disrespect. Let's go to culture here, because it's really important, right? Some cultures, the child cannot talk back. The child cannot raise his own voice. You can't be upset when adults are speaking to you. And sometimes when children experience trauma, they become very irritable and agitated. And so you may have a child that is lashing out, and all of a sudden what appears to you as disrespectful or rude may not really be rudeness, right? Or disrespect. It could just be that this child is really, really struggling, trying to manage all of these fireworks that are going on in his or her body that he or she can't quite understand. So you really want to check in. You want to ask the question, are you okay? Right? Rather than saying, don't be disrespectful, don't be rude. Are you okay? What is happening to you? What's going on? Can we talk? Why this behavior all of a sudden? This is not you. Why are you behaving this way? You want to ask these questions, and then you open the door for the child to at least share or say, I'm not okay. And sometimes a classic one that kids will say is, I don't want to talk right now. Okay? And when you're hearing that, give them room, but you want to come back and explore.
Yep. There's something there that you need to address eventually.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And it's common, we see with the teens and kids, depression shows up as irritability, anxiety can show up as irritability, PTSD. So definitely that bad attitude we see, sometimes we need to explore, and maybe something has happened. Maybe they're being bullied at school, or they're not coping with the divorce as well as we thought. So it's good to explore that.
Yeah, or even something as simple as friendship. We don't see grief as trauma sometimes, or loss as trauma, but it is. They may be losing a good friend at school. They may be having some conflict with their peers, and you have no clue what's happening. But if you explore, you'll be able to find out this is a major loss for this child, and this can really cause anxiety and depression. Because it's all fear driven. So all of these things could really be happening to this child, and you really want to check in.
It's true. I've had middle and high schoolers. That's the thing they want to talk about in therapy, is when they lost a friend, even sometimes in 3rd or 4th grade, they still think about it, and it was traumatic. And I think we don't assume that. We almost act like their emotions are not as developed or important, but they're having real human emotions, and those things are a big deal.
Yeah. Well, it comes down to our attachment. So they're losing an attachment figure. Right? And that person may be their peer, but that's still an attachment that they're losing. And when we lose attachment, we're never more threatened than when we lose our attachment to someone.
Right.
So that's just something to think about.
Okay. I've had a question asked before. When the trauma happened, I couldn't move. Why did that happen? That might be interesting for our listeners. Why does that happen sometimes?
Yeah, that is really our body's natural response. So we know that we have the fight, flight, and freeze mode that our body will go into when something bad or something traumatic happens to us. We normally talk about the fight and the flight, right? We talk about the freeze a lot. And that's really what's happening. The body is just freezing up. The body is really becoming paralyzed. You find this a lot with rape cases, or sometimes with children who are beaten, severely beaten, right, by parents. And the child is being, really flogged, which is really abusive, to the point where they become paralyzed and can't really move. They're so frightened, they overcome with fear that they can't move. And so that's really what it is that freeze mode. It's the body's way. It's another form of fight, but it's just more a paralytic kind of fight where the body just can't respond anymore. And it just surrenders to that pain. So that's really what it is. If you're experiencing that, you're really in freeze mode, and your body is trying its best, but that's the best it can do in the moment.
Yeah, just to survive. And I think it makes sense what you're saying. Sometimes when we know we're powerless, it's almost like in the situation of an assault or a kid getting beat, they know there's nothing I can do. So maybe like the quieter, the less resistant I am, it'll just be over and I can get out of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about after trauma. So trauma has occurred. Are there ways that we can prevent PTSD or try and be preventative, treat it?
Well, there's really no clear way scientifically proven to prevent PTSD, right? Because if we don't treat PTSD, or if we don't get help for the trauma, we're going to experience PTSD more than likely. I know the research says, I think about 15% or so of people will go into full PTSD after a traumatic event. And so if you, what I'll normally say is the best thing to do is to try to talk about it as early as possible.
Yeah.
Right. Try to get the help as something bad happens to you. Find a trusted person. Of course, you're not going to talk to everyone you meet, but find a trusted person that you feel safe and secure with, and try to address that issue. That to me is the best way. And that's what I've seen even with clients. It's just to say, the ones who have reached out right away and say, I'm getting a divorce, but I want to be proactive. I want to come in and start to talk before, I go through the divorce. Or I just lost my significant other and I want to come in before this grief overwhelms me. Those people have been able to really cope effectively. So that's really the best thing to do, is finding help as early as possible.
Yep. Absolutely. And I do know that with EMDR, one of the trauma treatments we use, the sooner you do it, the less symptoms there are. So that is something sometimes you can, I believe, because I've seen it, that you prevent PTSD from developing if you can do the EMDR quick enough and kind of help their brain process it in the way it should if it wasn't in that survival mode. So there are some things, seeking therapy early, kind of being willing to talk about it early, which takes vulnerability and bravery, because that's hard. We often want to avoid, but it can really help you in the long run not to be down and anxious for so long.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of that, the research really is that what it really does is it helps you to cope better. Right. So and once you have the tools to cope, then you probably won't go into a full-blown PTSD, but you may still have some of the symptoms, but you won't go into a full-blown PTSD. Right.
Yeah.
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
And is it ever too late to look for help? Let's say you already have developed PTSD.
Never, ever. It's never late. We know from Vietnam vets that 40 years after returning from war, the ones who have not gotten help still have PTSD symptoms, and they can still get help. I've treated vets who way out of service have been able to, get the effective tools to cope and really survive. Because that's really what it's about. It's surviving and coping, right? Because there's no cure, right? We want to be clear about that. There is no cure for PTSD. However, we can get the tools to be able to live a healthier life and to cope.
Exactly. And I've had the same with specifically those who have been through some type of sexual abuse or assault. They've come years later. Maybe it was stuff in childhood with PTSD that they've lived with lifelong, but then they're able to decrease those symptoms and even, reestablish healthy relationships, healthy sexual content, all those things that, for years, they just thought this is just how life is. So it's really never too late. I see that too clinically.
No.
Yeah. What if we don't do therapy though? Will the symptoms naturally go away? Is it like the time heals all wounds? What do you think about that, Goumah?
No, they don't. If you just go back to what I just explained about the brain and how it works. So when you have that shift in your brain, it's not as if that shift just, the brain would just reshift itself without you doing anything. It doesn't happen that way, right? So what you find is you have people going throughout life just really being reactive, or very, hypervigilant, have to, most of their lives, because they're trying to survive. The brain is trying to survive. The brain wants to be healthy. It wants to go back to where it can be logical, right? But it can't be logical without resolving the trauma. And what the trauma resolution is not, again, erasing everything that happened. The brain is not going to erase what happened. But what will happen is that, right, when you think about the trauma, you're less reactive to it. That's the resolution. That's how you know you've resolved the trauma, right? You're less reactive to the experience. So you're able to be whole again.
Awesome. So maybe I imagine a trigger comes up and I know my clients still they notice it, but it's not that their body reacts or they feel a flush of emotion or heat or their heart beating fast. So I might think back that memory is always unpleasant. I'll never feel good about it, but it no longer affects my whole system. It kind of takes over for
Mhm.
that minute or hour or day, even like it did
Mhm.
before.
Exactly. I'll give you a classic example. So I'm a 9-year war survivor. When I first relocated from my country, Liberia, to the United States, every time I would hear fireworks, I would go into full panic.
Right.
That was prior to doing trauma resolution work. After that, I actually attend July 4th events now. I can sit through fireworks now. So it's not that my body is not aware that there's something going on, but I'm less reactive to it. And that's exactly what trauma resolution does for us.
Okay. So you might be saying that you still, maybe you wouldn't choose a fireworks show as your first, choice for an evening,
No,
but you can do it. If your family wants to go, your girls want to see the fireworks, you can do it. And it's not like a miserable experience now.
absolutely. And again, we're talking about fireworks, right? Versus somebody who's raped. Now, you're not going to choose to go back and visit that person. That's not what you're going to do. So we're talking about the different levels of trauma here as well.
Right.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
maybe that person, they could be around men again or have healthy
Mhm.
contact with men again over
Mhm.
time as they do their
Correct.
work. Well,
Correct.
all right, Goumah, we could keep talking for days, but we actually have to wrap up. So thank you so much for joining me today. And we hope our listeners got to just learn about trauma and maybe have some hope if you've been through something. And even now you're experiencing symptoms, that there's hope for you and there's help. And again, if you join the program maybe halfway through, go back and listen to the first half. You can find it on your favorite podcast channel, Wellspring on the Air, or you can go to our blog page at wellspringmiami.org. So today you will see the show under the title of Trauma. And so it's time to wrap up. This is Lindsey Steffen with Wellspring on the Air, because hearts and minds matter.